Hey there, and welcome to another album review. And today we have A Thousand Eyes with the album Duality, which is one of the artists that was involved in the Signalis OST. I was just searching around, and someone essentially just recommended this to me after I did the Signalis review. So I was like, oh, okay, yeah, let's check it out. And I can say that I understand now why there's so much, or why Signalis soundtrack is the way it is. Most of this album mostly involves either like a tree pop, where it's sort of like this noisy, grainy type sounds that kind of like sound malicious with a bit, right, like a hip hop bit. Or we also have pretty much atmospheric tracks. Like this album has a lot of atmospheric tracks, or I guess ambient tracks would be the better like designation of them, I guess. But yeah, essentially there's a lot of tracks that have more of a focus of creating a little bit of an atmosphere rather than just necessarily having a song or whatever. A lot of it sounded to me like the 90s sort of electronic sound where everything just sounds super dreamy, where it sounds like sort of this future, that is more of a like aspiration than a reality. I actually found that super interesting. At some point I was actually remembering like, yeah, this kind of sounds like what you would listen to like in the back rooms type thing, and I think that actually says a lot about the type of music, I guess, of the ambient music that this album has, which is pretty much, it sounds like the type of music that is there, but at the same time it doesn't quite like belong anywhere. Like it belongs, but it doesn't quite belong anywhere, it's sort of there, like there's familiarity, but it doesn't quite like belong anywhere. So you sort of have this sense of uneasiness. Like, for example, I listen to a lot of especially 90s drum and bass and jungle, mostly drum and bass though, and a lot of like drum and bass songs, besides having the drum and the bass, have a lot of like melodies that are mostly these sort of synth inspired, like dreamy sounds, dreamy landscapes type thing, right? And it's very positive, it's very aspirational. I think this album doesn't like quite do that. I think it takes the inspiration from that, but it sort of turns it on its head, where it's more about like creating this sense of a familiar place that doesn't quite like belong anywhere. It's sort of like a you're in a sort of transitional place, I guess, right? It's sort of like it's familiar, but you're not like it doesn't quite belong there. You don't quite belong there, if you know what I mean. But yes, essentially those are like the atmospheric tracks, especially when they turn to, or like they tend to be more, I guess, I don't want to say evil, but they tend to sound more menacing, I guess, more malicious, I guess. They definitely do a much better job, and that's where a lot of the I guess soundtrack comes from. I definitely like realized, oh yeah, this is definitely like what the soundtrack was not necessarily inspired for, but like I was like, oh yeah, okay, I get like the overlapping, and you kind of like understand the artist in a way, where you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense that this artist made that soundtrack, as they do sound pretty much the same. So I think it was kind of the right pick. As I was listening to some of the songs, and I was like, yeah, it was kind of the right pick to have this artist sort of make, especially the more ambient sounds or the ambient songs that Signalis actually has. So I was very like impressed with the entire album. I'm gonna be honest though, I did prefer the beginning of the album rather than the end. I think the end of the album, while it did provide some interesting sounds, I think it was just sort of more, I don't want to say like bare bones or like the worst or anything like that, but definitely there was a sort of expectation, I guess, that I had over the album, and the later songs just sort of focus a lot on especially having a beat more than anything, being a bit more, I guess, active, which is also why I think that at least for the soundtrack, the boss track, or at least like the more high octane tracks, the more terrifying tracks weren't made by A Thousand Eyes, because definitely like when it comes to higher tempo, or when it comes to especially having a beat and everything, the songs just didn't interest me as much, and they were definitely more on the side of, again, like, I don't want to say like generic, but definitely it felt like, there was something missing there, I guess. Like, there was a punch missing there, basically. So I definitely prefer, like, the more beginning of the album, where you definitely have a bigger focus on the atmospheric, or I guess ambient part of the tracks. And I don't know, like, to me, they just sounded better, even if they are tracks that are, not as, I guess, comforting, and do have this sort of like weird vibe about them that you can't quite put your finger on. I think they're quite good, actually. Like, again, I think that a lot of them are really nice, and having heard the soundtrack that this person contributed to, I can understand like why they were chosen, because again, like, the game sort of has the soundtrack where it sounds like it's an hostile place that you don't quite belong on, but it's not like the type of horror game where, oh yeah, you just have monsters or whatever. Like, the soundtrack isn't like that. The soundtrack of that game is more, you shouldn't be here type thing, like, there's definitely a certain sense of uneasiness with you being there. So a lot of the earlier tracks in this album actually do provide that a lot, and provide that in spades, and it's a very like interesting approach to having an ambient sort of track, right? Where instead of, at least most of the ambient tracks that I've heard, or at least the mixes of ambient tracks that I've heard, were definitely more on the side of like being comfortable and being like a company for, what you were doing, especially being on the background when I'm working or whatever. So they're usually more like minimal, they're more, especially more on the app side, I guess, right? They're not super intrusive or whatever. But yeah, no, like, here a lot of the tracks are more on the side of being a bit more unsettling for you and making you kind of uncomfortable, rather than just going for a more, being in the background, because it definitely didn't feel like they were in the background, but yeah, basically, like, that's the thing. Like, to me, it sounded like a twist, like, especially a dark twist on a lot of the 90s electronic dreamy landscapes, where you turn them on its head and it's like, oh, actually, it's kind of like depressing. At some point, like, I was remembering, like, the thought that came into my mind when I was listening to one of the songs was, I don't even remember the song, but it was, oh yeah, this is basically, like, those like dreamy 90s / early 2000 like games, like PS1 games, except you're a fucking doomer, and the world around you is collapsing, so you're completely depressed. Basically, that was like the thought that came into my head, because that's what like the songs sounded like, basically. They sounded like they were enjoyed by depressed people and like doomers. So yeah, I would say they did a good job at creating that atmosphere in the album, and even the album art. That's kind of the same thing. The album art is sort of like, the album art isn't unsettling because it's supposed to be something that is like gory or super flashy or super explicit. No, it's like something that is relatively normal, but you just sort of change a little piece here, which in this case would be like the mouth, and all of a sudden you sort of have these like this sort of unsettling thing of, like, there's nothing wrong with it, if you know what I mean, but it's like, it's sort of unsettling because it's something so, like, it's not minor, but it's definitely not as, like, again, big or perhaps as explicit or gory as usually some other horror stuff or horror media provides. Again, it's sort of like that sense of the back rooms, it's sort of like, like that place is familiar, but there's a sense of uneasiness towards it, so I would say that in that aspect, like, in terms of a theme for the album, I would say they did a pretty good job, honestly, and it was quite enjoyable. Again, like, the second part of the album, to me, especially the I guess trip-hop part, definitely, like, not as good in my opinion. I understand what he was trying to go for, definitely, especially, again, like, the, more, I guess, more, well, energetic, at least comparatively speaking, to the rest of the album, and still with that sort of uneasiness and more even malicious tone. But again, like, it just felt way more flat, because it felt way more run-of-the-mill, oh yeah, like, evil, like, sounds, rather than, like, this sort of a sense of uneasiness that the earlier songs had. But yeah, overall, honestly really nice project. My vibe meter right now is giving me like a 7 out of 10, which I think is pretty good, honestly. Yeah, I'm gonna go with a 7 out of 10. And with that being said, I'll see you tomorrow for another album.